Okay, we're recording. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Ann.
Hi, Judy.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey.
Hey, happy Poetry Month.
Yes.
So we have a good selection of poems for Poetry Month, so I'm really excited to start sending out the links and continue to observe our tradition that we've had the last few years of a poem a day during Poetry Month. So I guess I wanted to talk about something that's really been on my mind a lot, which is, what does poetry offer us at a time like this? Because, and the reason why that's been on my mind is because there is so much art and so many, creative forms of creative expression that we don't have access to now because of the pandemic. The museums are closed. There are no concerts. We can't go to the ballet. The performance series at Columbia State is canceled. Our students can't perform on their instruments or sing, So there's all these forms of art that we would normally have that we don't have now. But we can still have Poetry Month. We can still read our poems. And so what is a poem offer? The first poem of our series this month is called Pandemic by Lynn Unger. And she's not a famous poet. I've actually never heard of her before I encountered this poem. But it's a beautiful poem. It's about now, it's about what's happening now, which is, of course, one of the reasons why I wanted to choose it, because I think great poetry is always about now. And in reading it, she really is asking us to reframe how we're looking at this time of quarantine, that we don't look at it from a mindset of deprivation, but that it's a sacred time that, when we're opening up spiritually and filling ourselves and connecting with something greater than ourselves. The end of the poem echoes the marriage vows. I think that's pretty obvious. I think that was intentional, right? So long as we all shall live. And of course, in marriage vows, people become one body, right? That's one of the things you pledge when you get married. And I think she's implying that in this time of quarantine, we're all sort of recognizing that we are one body and that we have to take care of each other. And there's something about the medium of poetry that is allowing her to communicate the experience of that, right? Not just the idea of it, but the whole dimension of the experience, the emotions, the cognitive process of reframing. By presenting it in a poem, she's taking us to that place where we can experience that reframing of this time, and we do it while we're reading the poem. So I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to pick that poem in particular to start off with. What do you guys think? I feel like I've talked a lot now, so what do you guys think?
I wrote down some of my thoughts, and I wanted to respond to community and poetry. So bear with me. I'm going to read
Okay.
a few my random thoughts.
Okay.
Okay. So poet W.H. Auden wrote that a community is a group characterized by a love for something other than itself. And he was defining a crowd, a society, and a community. And I think in times of crisis, especially, we tend to take off that veneer of individualism, which very, very potent in America, because we do want to be part of something larger, something that is more important than the self. And yet John Donne said, no man is an island. And the ironic thing is now we are all being forced to be an island, and just to stay safe, to stay alive. But poetry can't change that, but poetry can sustain us, and it can reaffirm the world that we're stuck with, and it's a world that is always awful and beautiful at the same time. That's poetry makes me want to live another really
right. Yeah.
And I know I saw a video, and I'm sure millions have seen the video of these Italians out on their balconies, and someone is singing opera, and people are playing music, and some people are just banging pots and pans, and I'm sure someone was reciting poetry, perhaps Dante. And I felt such a deep sense of really of kinship for people halfway around the world. I think community really has no boundaries, and I think especially right now we really need to think in terms of the world, and that the world is our community. Poetry doesn't have any boundaries either, and I think because it can be shared, it's language. We have that in common. So I think this April, it's really especially poignant, I think, that we're sending out these poems, and I'm hoping that people will not only read them to themselves, but maybe share it with their partner, with their loved ones, email it to friends, post it on Facebook, just share it with as many people as you can. And
we don't have balconies to sing on, but we have poetry links that we can share.
Yes, I know. I know. I don't know, you know, by the end of April, I don't know, we may have poetry in the streets. I don't know.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. What about you, Jeff?
Well, I was thinking I've just got a new book of poetry by one of my friends, Shara Hammonds, and she has a poem in there called Autocorrect, about how when we're texting, some of her words get auto-corrected. And in her case, the word live, no, the word, it tends to auto-correct the words live and love. And I thought it was very fascinating how she builds this poem around that. But it got me to thinking about how, you know, poetry itself may not be auto-correcting our language, but it does correct our language in ways that are necessary. I think it was this past year that the poet W.S. Merwin died, who was one of my favorite poets. And at the beginning of his book, Travels, he has a poem where he said, the first lines say, "I always knew I came from another language." And I think that poetry, the best poetry, it feels like a language we know, but it also feels like another language.
Yes.
I don't really, this isn't how I would normally say things, but But, and so like, why? I mean, what is this really about? Well, his books were published by Copper Canyon. And, you know, Anne, you probably know this, Copper Canyon's symbol is a Chinese, like the Chinese symbol,
Oh, yeah,
bringing
that's
together
right.
like
Yes.
word and temple.
Yeah.
And those two words are, those two pictographs are combined in order to create this new word called poetry. And it's really word and temple. So, I mean, it kind of harkens back to the idea of how poetry began in hymn and chant and prayer and this kind of sacred language, Judy, that you've talked about in other locations. But
Yeah.
I think there's something really central about that and why we reach for it, because we know that our language can do something other than what it normally does.
Yes.
And, you know, in our culture, and maybe I don't know if I'm a good person to talk about this because I studied English and marketing. So I kind of like, I came out of two worlds where there's language that is edifying, and, you know, also grew up in a Baptist church. So language edifies and exhorts, or there's the possibility of that, right? Praise and all of that. And then there's this other side of my brain, which is language serves the marketplace.
Yes.
And it's about advertising, and it's about, you know, trying to frame a product, something to sell. And so I feel that war within myself, even about language, and it pulls me in these two directions. And I think that's amplified for a lot of people in our culture. I'd like to think that I lean more now toward the sacred and the edifying, and, you know, this other kind of language that is worthwhile.
Yeah, you know.
But I also think that, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to interject. I mean, you probably heard me say this too. One of the things I used to say a lot when I was younger was this idea that poetry makes what is ineffable articulate. You know, and it takes these experiences that we have trouble expressing, you know, that we have trouble putting into words, and it renders them in language. And so it allows us to know those things and to experience those things. So there's always this element of contradiction or paradox in the fact that a poem even exists, in my opinion. Yeah. You know, and I think that's why people are drawn to it. Because it, like I think I was saying in reference to the Remender poem, I mean, it can, a language, you know, it takes us into a particular experience, you know, I think marketing can do that too. You know, marketing can certainly take us into a particular experience, but it's different experientially. The quality of it is really different. I mean, I guess a poem is authentic in a way that a good marketing campaign is not.
Yeah. Well, they can be, but no, I was, as you're talking, it reminds me of, there's a Chinese poet, has a poem called Poplar. I think it's a poplar tree. And it's very, very short. All it says is, lost an arm, gained an eye.
Huh.
And, you know,
yeah.
You know, it reframes or makes you re-see what you've always seen, but you've never seen it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's why those of us who love poetry, we go to poems because we're still awakening to the world around us.
Yeah. That's one of the really cool things about poetry is the way that it'll flip things around perceptually.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, great poets are able to do that. So,
do you
anyway,
know the poem With Kit, Age 7 at the Beach by William Stafford? I think it's one of the ones on our list. If it isn't, it should be. But, you know, he climbs with his daughter up on a dune to overlook the ocean. And of course, there's a storm coming in.
Right.
And it's portrayed as this sort of absolute vista from which you're looking out. And at some point, the daughter asks him, she says, how far could you swim in such a storm, Daddy? And the poem ends by him saying, as far as was needed, and as I talked, I swam. And I've always loved the ending of that. It kind of takes something and reframes it again, like we're talking about. He recognizes the answer he just gave his daughter, that comfort, that
right.
assurance to give her about he would be able to protect her in this storm. No, I mean, even his answer is a storm.
Yeah.
And he's swimming for his life. It's such a wonderful, way to take language and do something with it that's literally never been done before. No one's ever said that. And I think the best poems give us a way of thinking that we hadn't quite encountered before.
Yeah, they make it new, right? To quote Ezra Pound, right? Make
Ezra
it new.
Pound, yeah.
Yeah, make it new. Yeah, there's something generative about a poem. I mean, yeah, and actually think about the Bible, right? I mean, God called the world into existence with language.
Yeah.
So there is this idea, this very ancient idea that language is the font of existence.
Mm. Yeah. Well, you think about the ways in which a lot of poetry becomes touchstones for us. We're all poets, so we're always quoting lines of poetry, and for lack of a better way of saying it, they become a kind of secular scripture for people's lives. You've quoted W.H. Auden, and I'm full of Tomas Transtromer. The human brain's endless planes are crumpled up to the size of a clenched fist. Or Richard Jackson over in Chattanooga, who says, there's a little stain of blood on the floor of heaven. When I read that poem years ago, I was like, oh,
wow,
I would love to have written that line.
Yeah.
But these things become so central to who we are as individuals. And then I think when more and more people feed into a line of poetry or into a specific poem, then that, and as you talk about, that community grows. More and more of us can gather here in this poem. We can gather in these lines or this image. If William Stafford says, justice will take us millions of intricate moves. It's such a fantastic statement, but it's going to take a lot of people to figure out what that means.
Yeah, that's true too. There's something communal about interpreting or understanding.
Yes.
So many cultures have their great poems that are unique to that culture. And you kind of need to be a part of that culture to understand the poem too. That's an interesting facet of poetry too.
But don't you think too that when, like, Anne, you were talking about there aren't any boundaries in poetry, and so I have a student in Franklin who is from Iran, and so since she was from Iran, I just asked her. I said, "Are you familiar with the poet Hafez?" Oh, she just lit up. What about Ghalib? Oh yeah, so Rumi, right. Yes, and so now, because I know this language or this poet that she knows, that she's memorized, right, in the original.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, this cultural difference that might exist between us, or even, teacher and student, all of a sudden, those things just disappear. Exactly. We just met right here so we could both express our appreciation for Rumi. So there's no boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true too.
And poems are really ageless. They age very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not all poems, but I would say a great deal of poems they do. They age well, and I think we can read Wordsworth or
Dickinson.
Emily Dickinson, of course, right? Who is sort of my personal poet.
Hundreds of years ago, the epics, and yet they still have something to say to us right now, today.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just the wonderful thing about poetry.
I just thought of a Rumi poem that I know. It's the only Rumi poem that I know. But I remember when I was in my 30s and I had this job that I really hated. I couldn't stand it. And for some reason, this poem really spoke to me. And it goes like this, and I'm just recalling it from memory, but it goes like this. May the thing that you love be what you do. There are 100 ways to kneel and kiss the ground.
Yeah.
And there was something about needing to do something that I loved, which I didn't feel like I was doing in my job.
Yeah.
And just being able to hold that thought in my head by recalling the poem helped me to feel connected to that aspiration, you know, even though I didn't feel like I was doing that in my daily life. So I feel like the poem can create a sacred space for us. I talked about that at the beginning of our conversation here, that the poem can create that space for us when we need it to sometimes. I think that's one of the things that poems do for us.
And it might also be, as you also mentioned, generative, that it kind of posits, or as Finn Burkert discusses, what we read kind of posits a reality that we then move off in the direction of that reality. I mean, I had a similar experience to what you're talking about, Judy, but I had it when I was 18 in college. And, I read William Stafford's poem called, I've suddenly forgotten the title of the poem, but where sometime when the river is ice, ask me mistakes I have made. And then the third line, he says, ask me if what I have done is my life. And I cannot tell you how that line scared me when I was 18 years old.
Oh, I think Jeff is frozen a little bit here.
I didn't want to get trapped in a world where that was the case. But just that line, it was so perfectly said that I didn't forget it. And it kind of haunted me. And, I think in many ways has shaped me as many other lines of poetry have as well.
Yeah, we all have poems that really stick with us. I remember that one of the first poems I ever really loved was Walt Whitman's poem, "Oh Captain, My Captain." I memorized, that was one of the first poems I ever committed to memory. I guess because I love the sound and the repetition. In some ways, it's not terribly characteristic of Whitman. But I remember, must have been around 12 or 13, but I went through a phase where I started memorizing a lot of poetry. I memorized Emily Dickinson. I remember memorizing a lot of John Crowe Rankin's poetry. He was a writer that I really admired when I was younger. And then when I got to college, I remember memorizing Edward Arlington Robinson, some of his poems. Gertrude Schnackenberg, I remember. Yeah, I can still, there are probably still a couple of her poems that I can reel off.
I've got one of her books bedside.
Yeah, somewhere I have her first book, Portraits and Elegies, which, and of course she went to Mount Holyoke. Oh my gosh, there it is.
On a Supernatural Love.
Yes, Supernatural Love, right. Yeah, that was actually one of the poems that I memorized. I remember this supernatural love poem. Oh God, my father at the dictionary stand. That's how it begins. If I really was like mind over matter, I could probably remember the whole thing. Um, and that poem is in triplets, and that was one of the reasons why she wanted to write it, was because it's not a very common uh, uh, sonic structure for a poem. So she wanted to write a poem in triplets. So that's one of, but when you memorize it and you read it out loud, actually, that's one of the things that's interesting about that poem, that the rhyme is not heavily foregrounded. I mean, it's there, but it's not overwhelming. And I think that's one of the things that's really masterful about that poem, is the way that she's able to take what could be a really clunky, intrusive rhyme scheme and manage it in a really pleasing way. So that's another thing good poets do. I mean, they do things that kind of seem impossible to do in language, and draw us in.
And then there's the music.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I guess Yeats is, well, one of my favorites, and was my early favorite. It just he is so musical,
Yeah.
and especially his early poems. But it's also wonderful when you love a poet and you read all of their work, and you can see how their work has changed and how their thought process has changed. With like Yeats early on, his subject matter was he'd write about fairies, and not exclusively, but a lot of well, of course he's Irish, so it's about Ireland and just Irish superstitions, and yet as he aged, his poetry did get more political, and
yes, it did.
Kind of there was still music there, but I think it clashed a little bit more in still beautiful musical ways.
Yeah.
So I always think I just love to read poems, especially out loud. You can read poems to yourself, but really they're especially powerful when you read them out loud, because you can hear that music.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Jack Gilbert says in his poem, A Brief for the Defense, do you know that poem? He says, we must admit there will be music despite everything. And it's a poem that he begins with,
Right.
sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere.
Right.
It's this poem about devastation.
Yeah.
But we must risk delight, he says. And I think part of the delight of language is the way that it sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
And that's why the Italians are singing in their balconies, right? We must admit, that there is music everywhere, right? And that's why we wanted to have Poetry Month.
Yeah.
Because we must admit that there is music everywhere.
And risk delight.
Yes. I think that's probably a good note to end on.
I think so.
Okay.
So be risky.
Yes, so be risky. Read poetry and read it out loud.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm going to end the recording now. So let me